Thank you to everyone who's joined us this afternoon for our next colloquium, which is hosted by the Department of Philosophy at Fort Hare and the Center for Leadership Ethics in Africa, also at Fort Hare. And today we welcome from our sister institution, Rhodes University, Department of Philosophy, Prof. Ward Jones, who'll be talking about beliefs and truth in a paper called Post-Trust, Not Post-Truth. So thanks for making time, Ward, to come and join our seminar, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity. I had always been working on this paper on paper by myself, and I don't think I've actually ever talked to it. So it might show in the paper itself. But anyway, let me give it a shot to try to give you a sense of this longish paper. It's almost 30 pages. It was an invitation by the editor of Critical Review to write this piece, and then I turned it in, and he died. So it then just was submitted and published without a whole lot of comment. Chris gave me some comment, but all right, let me go with it. So this first page, what I'm giving you here, is the sort of the structure of the paper. Let me see. So there are 8 sections in the paper, and what I'm giving you is the titles. The editor didn't want me to number them or give any structure like this, other than just the titles. So they're just 8 sequential sections, but they roughly divide in the paper in thirds if you go by what I'm doing. So in the first 9 pages of the paper, I'm basically giving the best account I can of post-truth, by the idea of post-truth, the concept of post-truth, by modifying, by idealizing the definition. But then I point out that it doesn't apply as well, or in fact, I argue that we shouldn't be using it if we're going to be using it to describe a polity in which truth is not suppressed. So my idealized definition works quite well for a polity in which truth is suppressed, but I'm going to argue that it doesn't work well, or we should use it only with care in a polity in which truth is not suppressed. So in the second section is my negative account. It's the sort of the philosophical heart of the paper. The sort of the second third from pages 72 to 81. There's 4 sections in here, and I'm basically arguing against the practice of describing as post-truth a polity in which truth is not systematically suppressed, as it implies the ascription of biased beliefs to a segment of the population. And so that's going to be that part of the paper is a sustained argument against ascribing biased beliefs to a population. So then in the third third of the paper, the last third of the paper, I defend post-truth, my alternative concept, through giving 2 examples. So one is the one about which most people nowadays are concerned, that of contemporary populist discourse, trapping followers in bubbles of distrust toward knowledge workers. And there I'll be reinterpreting a recent account by Elizabeth Anderson, who argues that for the notion of epistemic bubbles, and I'm going to be arguing that we should be working not with what she thinks of as an epistemic bubble, but rather something like a bubble of distrust. And then the second second example of a post-trust polity is one in which a kind of complainant is being systemically distrusted. So, following a post-Civil War trend toward protecting girls and white women from sexual assault and coercion, the U.S. polity of the early decades of the 20th century grew distrustful of adolescent girls and women who complained of rape. I'll talk about this briefly. So those are both largely empirical, or at least I'm depending heavily on empirical work to make my points. Elizabeth Anderson's sort of political interpretation, and then the history of rape. But I'm wanting to bring those two together to point out that they belong together, right? That what's happening belongs, is a kind of cultural shift that we understand, not in terms of screwed up beliefs, but rather in terms of distrust of a kind of informant. Okay, so let me give the account, summarize the kind of defense I give of post-truth. But this is a list of concepts related to and including that of post-truth. The first four are directly from the Oxford English Dictionary. I've italicized them. The last three are all invented by me, but they take the same form. And the final one is my sort of reinterpretation or my sort of proposal of what post-truth should be. So here's the definition of post-truth from the OED: relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping political debate or public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So the first move I make is to propose a form of this definition to show us the kind of definition it is, to show us how other different notions could fall into this same kind of category. So I'm giving it just the post-X form. And what I'm taking out is the underlying bits, which are X and then Y. Relating to or denoting circumstances in which X is less influential than in shaping political debate or public opinion than Y. So here's another definition from the OED. There's three definitions from the OED, which basically take this form. And one thing I want to point out in each of these is that Y is merely assumed. It's not actually stated. Over relating to a time or society in which national identity has become less important, designating or relating to a time in which a particular society is no longer characterized by a strong adherence to political or social ideologies. Over relating to or exhibiting a cultural shift away from racist values or attitudes, especially as reflected in legislation. So, yeah, the first thing I've already said I want to point out is that Y is just assumed. It's just assumed that there is something which has taken over national identity, ideology, racist values in public discourse. And secondly, I want to point out that what is post, that is, in this case, national identity, is stated explicitly in the definition, national identity. Ideology is stated explicitly. And racist values or attitudes is stated explicitly. That's actually not true in the original definition of post-truth. So my first proposal regarding post-truth is to make it just truth. We should just make the definition of post-truth. We should remove objective facts and replace it with truth. Just to show that we could go on further with examples in this vein. Here's post-sacred, which is also not a word. It's just my imagined form of secularized, relating to or denoting circumstances in which religion and the sacrosanct are less influential in shaping political debate or public opinion than other considerations. And then post-trust, which is the one I'm defending, relating to or denoting circumstances in which a customary source of informants is less influential in shaping political debate or public opinion than it once was. So the two proposals that I am then suggesting to post-truth is first that we make X just truth rather than objective facts. And then secondly, that rather than use this quite limited category of things which can count as replacing truth in the public discourse of the polity you're describing, rather than keeping it that limited, we would have a much more useful notion if we were to simply generalize it out to whatever. So one thing in defense of this definition is that it allows us to categorize as post-truth a polity in which truth is systemically suppressed. And this is something of a Oceania, which is the totalitarian state of George Orwell's 1984, is something of a bogeyman for many of the writers on post-truth, that we're working our way towards this kind of systemic suppression. So that's one reason to want to be able to include a totalitarian state in our usage of the notion. Okay, so that's in its plus, and that gives us, I think, a better account of post-truth and a more useful one. However, if you describe a polity as post-truth in the absence of systemic suppression of the relative truths, then you're going to be committing yourself to ascribing not merely false beliefs, but also biased beliefs to some of its citizens. And the second third of the paper is a sort of systemic argument against that. We first need to distinguish here between false beliefs and biased beliefs. To describe a belief as biased is to explain it. That's the crucial difference. And describing a belief as false does not, in most cases, entail any particular explanation of it. Bias without falsehood is possible. Right? You can accuse someone as being biased even though they do actually believe the truth. So they didn't get there in the right way. They got there because they're biased. So bias without falsehood is possible, and more importantly, falsehood without bias is possible. And most importantly for my paper, the attribution of falsehood to others is in principle usually possible without ascribing bias, without ascribing biased beliefs to them. The argument against biased beliefs is to point out first that biased beliefs are not and cannot be acknowledged by the believers who are said to have biased beliefs. So in this regard, biased beliefs are just like false beliefs. The Moore's paradox is named after G.E. Moore, the Cambridge philosopher from the early part of the 20th century. Moore's paradox was the paradox of assertions like this: I believe that P, but as a matter of fact, P is false. And the discussion what Moore was interested in, and what almost all philosophers are interested in, is how to explain the paradox, how to account for the paradox. But I don't want to do that here. I just want to take it as a given, that I cannot make sense of myself believing something and at the same time taking it to be false. And furthermore, and then here's really the heart of the paradox, I as a hearer cannot make sense of a speaker who makes Moorean assertions. So even though I might say of you that you have a false belief, I can't make sense of you if you say, yes, I do have that belief, but as a matter of fact, it's false. Right? So even though I can attribute a false belief to you, I can't make sense of you're saying that you yourself have a bias believed. And this is completely mirrored in the attribution of bias belief. So here we're working with the first person avowal of a bias belief. I believe that P, and I do so for the benefit which it brings. And in previous work, I've argued for this. This is a statement from the 2001 paper. It simply does not make sense to see myself as both believing that P is true and being convinced that I do so because of factors that have nothing to do with P's being true. And that this is also true of from the third person. As a hearer, I actually, even though I can attribute bias to someone, and it's very, very easy to do so. You simply identify how the belief benefits them in some way. Right? It's very, very easy to attribute bias, but we can't actually make sense of someone who themselves say that they hold the belief because of that bias. Okay, so there's the mirror, but of these two attributions that we make through disagreement, right? Attributions of false beliefs, the attribution of bias. But the important difference between bias and falsehood is that, number one, bias is falsehood is the attributing falsehood to others is in principle going to be unavoidable, but attributing bias is not. And secondly, that in attributing bias to someone, I am explaining their belief. Again, I'm offering an account of them, how they got to this belief. And that is going to be something that people must reject. And it's actually going to be almost always more objectionable than the mere disagreement, than the mere falsity. And I think it's Pascal's wager. I'm going to go through this quite quickly. It's Pascal's wager, which really makes this most evident. So if you don't know Pascal's wager at all, this might lose you, but I'm going to start by thinking of Pascal as responding to someone who's accusing Christians of bias belief. So let's imagine him as responding to someone who thinks many Christians believe in the articles of their faith for the benefit, that is mortality, which these articles promise them. Now, from that point of view, if someone seeing Pascal responding to that person, then the first thing he's going to be pointing out is that the benefit promised to Christians for believing is infinite, right? So it's an infinite benefit. It's not just any benefit. And that means that if you think that there is a non-zero chance that the Christian articles of faith are true, then it's reasonable for you to believe in the Christian articles of faith. So that he's turning the accusation of bias on its head and saying, whoever you are, if you don't believe, if you think that there's a non-zero chance that this is true, that means that gives you reason to believe it because of the infinity of what is promised and because of the negligibility of what is lost, which is a faithful, a belief, a false belief, and a pious life. Okay, so that's the wager, to turn the accusation of bias back onto the atheist. The important point, though, is that Pascal knows that the wager will not bring his reader to believe in the articles of the Christian faith. Pascal wants his reader to experience firsthand the powerlessness of benefit for believing to bring about belief. By giving you the wager, right? Philosophers make so much of the fact that the wager, doesn't work, and he was crazy to ask his readers to believe upon reading the wager. But he knew that was never going to happen. He wanted his reader to experience the pull of benefit for belief, and how it was completely powerless, right? So he has his readers say, yes, but my hands are tied and my lips are sealed. I am being forced to wager and I am not free. I am being held fast and I am so made that I cannot believe. What do you want me to do then? And Pascal's advice is go to church, basically. Taking holy water, having masses said, and so on, that will make you believe quite naturally. We shouldn't get caught up in what Pascal is asking you to do here, which is to go to church. Because in telling you how you as a non-believer are going to come to believe, he's telling you the difference between who you will be when you become a believer and who you are now, right? So it's going to be a matter of going through church, going through a process of being a member of a community, and then coming to believe. But at that point, what got you to go to church, right, will be as it was originally, right? All it did, it never brought about the belief, and what it did get you to do is to bring you to where you saw the truth. So this is just a quote, the second point. From my paper, Christians do not explain in the same ways their commitment to the articles of faith, but Pascal and the constraint. I didn't explain what the constraint is. That's this thing I was arguing for up here, that I can't believe I can't hold a biased belief. I can't hold a belief and at the same time take it to be biased. That's the constraint. Pascal reminds us that Christians do not and cannot explain their beliefs as the result of their own bias towards immortal life. Christians refer variously to their communities, their practices, and interpretations of the Bible, and to God himself. So that what the wager is really showing us is the powerlessness of bias. So it's going to be it's always going to be working behind the scenes or indirectly, and the reader sees that for herself. And then secondly, that it's going to be left behind, and you're going to have a completely different account of what is going on when you come to form the belief. So bias is still not going to be part of the story. So the practice of ascribing false beliefs to others is unavoidable, but doing so does not in principle entail explaining false beliefs in one way rather than another. The practice of ascribing biased beliefs to a general population, or just a group of people, is in principle avoidable, as members of the population will have their own explanations on offer. In contrast to the attribution of bias, these explanations do not involve redescribing the believers themselves, in ways to which they object. And I then, in the last few pages of this part of the paper, I focus very quickly about the power of redescription. In the words of other people, Richard Rorty in Irony, Contingency, and Solidarity continually comes back to the danger of humiliating someone in redescribing them. And I also briefly referenced Lugones and Spellman, a paper from 1983 on early third wave feminist piece, about the importance of rejecting redescription in the overall project of feminism. So they speak of the desire and insistence that we give our own accounts of our movements and actions. For it matters to us what is said about us, who says it, and to whom it is said. Having the opportunity to talk about one's life, to give an account of it, to interpret it, is integral to leading that life rather than being led through it. Okay, and it is bias, describing someone as having a biased belief, which involves the redescription in a way in which just attributing a false belief does only to a far lesser extent. Okay, final third of the paper. I then move to giving the two examples of post-trust polities. So I'll come back just to remind you of the definition, my definition of post-trust, relating to or denoting circumstances in which a customary source of informants is less influential in shaping political debate or public opinion than it once was. Important here is that a post-trust polity has undergone a cultural shift. Right? It's a shift. It's a systemic shift within the population of coming to distrust a kind of informant. And in the first example, the informants are knowledge workers, and in the second example, they are complainants in before police or in courts of law. Okay, so let me just give this first example. And then, let me just talk through the Elizabeth Anderson example, and then quickly through the history from the US. I'm leaning heavily on really great paper that came out just a couple of years ago called Epistemic Bubbles on Authoritarian Politics. And her concern, Anderson's concern, is with explaining how what she calls epistemic bubbles have arisen. She understands epistemic bubbles as being formed around claims, right? Around claims being made and beliefs being held. So politically consequential bubbles have formed around scientific claims about risk, that's the first kind, and around delegitimizing claims about government, public policy, politicians, and influential people. And that's the second kind. But they're coming to they are in the ones that are these are the toxic falsehoods that are in these bubbles, and which people outside of them take them to be sort of dangerous and pernicious. So she's thinking of examples like toxic falsehoods, as she calls them, like vaccines cause autism, which will be a claim about scientific claims about risk, so sort of rejecting claims that vaccines are not harmful by making the claims about the opposite, and then the delegitimizing claims about science and other knowledge workers can come in the form, say, like a hoax or being corrupt. Knowledge workers are often described as corrupt as well. So here's her story, her answer. And this is her interpretation of populist discourse. Populism is a strategy for mobilizing voters around an authoritarian public agenda of suppressing minority rights and disrupting the critical pluralistic representation and epistemic functions of civil society. It essentially depends on promoting distrust. The italics are hers, but the underlining is mine. Promoting distrust of empirically oriented institutions and expertise in the academy, the media, and the civil service, on undermining empirically guided expert advice informing public policy, on replacing policy-oriented empirical discussion with trolling and insults, on delegitimizing the political opposition by promulgating slanders and conspiracy theories against its leaders and policies, on promoting group norms of dismissing any claims that discredit the populist party line. I'm accepting everything she says here for the sake of argument, right? She's done all the sort of legwork here, and then she's giving us an interpretation of populist discourse, and she's using that to argue that to explain how epistemic bubbles have then arisen. That is how toxic falsehoods have arisen. But she doesn't think that this discourse itself constitutes an epistemic bubble, because she says, and this is the next quotation, since such discourse does not express beliefs, it does not create an epistemic bubble. Yet it creates the functional equivalent of a bubble by blocking the group's engagement with evidence in an accuracy-guided way, along with engagement in the cooperative empirical inquiry with outsiders. Okay, so that's the bit that I'm just wanting to sidestep. Because she wants to explain toxic falsehoods, that is, how she understands epistemic bubbles as being surrounding toxic falsehoods, she has to then ascribe bias to some extent to the population. She makes lots of maneuvers throughout the paper to avoid that, but she can only avoid it to some extent, right? She still ends up attributing bias to a certain segment of the population, even though she often claims that these are more group interpretive, as she calls them, claims, that they aren't actually, in many people's mouths, they aren't expressing beliefs. So she tries to get around the issues of bias that way. But I think it would be much easier and preferable if we simply talk about bubbles of distrust rather than epistemic bubbles, that we simply accept this account of how populist, if it's right, that this account of populist discourse simply creates bubbles of distrust. So then we don't have to, as philosophers, as it were, go and engage, try to understand toxic falsehoods, and furthermore, we're not going to be attributing bias to the community. That we simply focus on the loss of trust, because it's that is generated the toxic falsehoods. So a polity can be described as post-trust when citizens have trapped themselves in bubbles of distrust of knowledge workers. Sorry about all this. Okay. A polity can be described as post-trust when citizens have trapped themselves in bubbles of distrust of knowledge workers. The last example is fairly straightforward, and obviously I'm relying heavily on historians. Here I'm just quoting from one historian, Estelle Friedman, from a book in 2013. And this is a history of rape in the United States. So the history of rape consists in large part, she says, in tracking the changing narratives that define which women may charge which men with the crime of forceful unwanted sex and whose accounts will be believed. And I've added those italics. That it's a matter of, the history of rape is a matter of whether complaints are being accepted by the polity. So she and other historians trace a late 19th century expansion of the protections of girls and white women against sexual assault and coercion, and then an early 20th century growing distrust of women and teens who complained of sexual assault, leading up to sort of culminating in the 30s and sort of continuing on from then. She writes that during this period, juries, judges, and social workers, and this also includes psychologists, took a less protective and at times more punitive stance towards young women who had consensual relations. Adolescents, rather than the state, were increasingly expected to take responsibility and then faulted for failing to protect themselves. So this is simply an example of another way in which a polity can become post-trust, which is not by creating bubbles around themselves, but perhaps you might say by creating bubbles around complainants themselves to their detriment. Okay, let me stop there. Sorry, I have gone longer than I thought I would hope to.
Thanks, Ward. Thanks very much. Don't go away though. We'll have time for questions. We've still got plenty of time for questions. Perhaps Brianna, you've got your hand up already. Perhaps we'll start with you. If anyone else wants to mention anything, or perhaps in the chat bar, just type away or put your hand up. So,
Great,
Brianna?
Thank you. So the first thing that I want to question, Ward, is your claim that these polities that you're talking about are not, in fact, post-truth in the sense of suppressing truth. So most of the information, most of the beliefs that we form come these days through some kind of media, and the algorithms that are in place in terms of this media can actually mean that we live in a completely different world, really, to someone right next to me, okay? And I just wonder in what way it's useful to kind of to throw out the fact that just because there isn't an intentional actor like the Ministry of Truth, the fact that truth is nonetheless being suppressed, right? I mean, it might not be like an intentional behavior, but it's something that's happening nonetheless. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing that I want to ask is related to that, and that is that, as with Pascal's wager, we might want to actually try and change beliefs of individuals and groups, and based not on the truth of those beliefs, but rather on the consequences that might follow from us holding that belief. So certain beliefs might end up with us having a more equitable society. Should we not, and I'm throwing this out there for you to consider, should we not be setting an algorithm based on that in our media, for example? That said, I still think that your post-trust adjective is very useful. But yeah, I'll just engage with those two things for now. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't think it's accurate to describe truth as being suppressed, say in the United States, because it's available. It is being clouded, but the cloudiness the clouding is independently undertaken, and it doesn't fool, right, a lot of us. So there's a sense in which, very important sense in which, these groups are self-segregating. rather than being any kind of suppression. Yeah, on the part of anyone. You can obscure, you can sow doubt, but that's a different process from not making the truth available. And I'm sorry, I didn't understand your second question. You're going to have to come back and say.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's give someone else a chance if we want to, and I can we can get back to me if there's time in the end. Thank you. Thank you.
So Jason van Niekerk. This seems like a reunion of our 2003, 2004.
Hello, Jason.
Good to see you there.
Hello, Jason.
Hi, Ward. And yeah, no, we're in danger of generating a bubble of our own, but I'll chuck this out here. So I like the idea of the post-trust thing, but I'm just wondering what kind of traction it gives me. Because, for example, and this goes to what you just said about self-segregating. So when it comes to me trying to wonder whether I'm in my own bubble, I engage with Jonathan Haidt or Thomas Sowell or someone like that. And I recognize that I have a distrust toward their positions, and I try to question myself about whether I am embubbled against them. And that might be so what I'm interested in is, if I use the epistemic bubble model, I consider that I might have labeled some propositions or positions that people I've identified as coming from a certain place will endorse or occupy that differ from mine, maybe because I consider them unjustified, and I'll question myself for additional skepticism. So it seems to me like what you're saying is that we're pointing to the relationship of mistrust is the part of that that's doing the work, not specifically what propositions I have.
Exactly.
So I suppose what I'm interested in is what extra utility or traction, what clarity do I get from saying to myself that I'm considering this in terms of, I don't trust people coming from this place. Does that help me to approach the problem of distrusting Jonathan Haidt or Jordan Peterson or someone like that in a different way than asking myself if I'm biased against their starting assumptions or something?
I'm not. Let me ask for a bit of clarification. Look, I'm not. If you're asking whether a bubble of distrust, let's work with just a bubble of distrust rather than the epistemic. Just work with that. Okay. So if you're asking, here I am attributing a bubble of distrust to this crowd because they distrust these knowledge workers. And then I ask myself, well, am I in a bubble of distrust? Am I not creating a bubble of distrust by distrusting these knowledge workers? Which leads me to, okay. Yeah, that I'm fine with that. I mean, I'm not going to be able to. The very notion of a bubble of distrust, I don't think it should necessarily be a normative notion, perhaps. Because those on the inside of a bubble of trust think the bubble of trust is the bubble of distrust is protecting them. It's protecting them from harmful ideas that are coming from these knowledge workers. So can we then use it in other ways? Yeah, I think we can, and we have to then debate really and why this one is important. The bubbles that are leading people to not do anything about climate change, and the ones that not. All I'm saying is that we all agree those are the important ones. This is a better way of talking about them, and perhaps talking with them about that, than focusing on the toxic falsehoods.
Thanks. I think I'm just interested in how that works, but I'm agreeing with you. Yeah.
I can say more, and if there's more time about how that works. I'm not quite sure what more you'd like to hear.
I'm interested. I don't want to monopolize if there are other questions.
Okay.
I will be hitting you up for a copy of the paper so I can follow up offline.
Cool.
Okay. Just while we're waiting for anyone else, I have a question. I was hoping you could maybe check on. I was just thinking your paper wants to shift our discussions and descriptions from considerations of truth of people like this from truth to trust, about people who select or follow evidence which suits their preferences. I was just thinking it doesn't just happen with populism or authoritarians. We also find this kind of thing in academia, even with economists or Marxists on the left, lawyers, all sorts of people. So are we not going to miss something distinctively epistemic in our accounts of such a situation? Where beliefs about what is true involve these other considerations about positionality.
Look at can I put the definition up again?
Sure.
Of post-trust. So I didn't follow the first part of your question as to how.
Let's see.
So relating or denoting circumstances. I don't think that's as specific as you were saying.
Yeah, that's post-trust.
That's right.
I'm just thinking though, that's like that's about trust rather than truth. And when we're talking about yeah.
Go ahead. I mean, it's customary sources of informants, and informants offer testimony, and what we want from informants is truth. So truth is there, but we're not talking about any truths, you might say.
I'm just thinking, like, in a way, people have it seems our language of what truth is shifted to some extent. So in the early 20th century or in a totalitarian state, you'll have people suppressing truth, actively censoring. And these days that becomes kind of implausible unless you can somehow maintain a great firewall. And right. So it makes more sense if you want to influence people, not to suppress the truth, but then to just flood the airwaves so that what's more noticeable is what you want to get people to believe what you want. And because of that, people now consider positionality as central to what counts as truth. So where someone's coming from will influence their assessment of that person's beliefs. So there is something about a move from one kind of conception of truth as coherence or correspondence with objective facts to another kind of post-truth environment, which is not just about distrust, but about what suits people's position.
I guess I'm not sure I understand what phenomenon it is that you're talking about, what loosening has happened. But accepting positionality does not imply accepting that you have biased beliefs, that you're believing for benefit, right? I mean, to accept positionality, in fact, might involve accepting bias towards certain individuals. And I think we can acknowledge bias towards individuals. It's biased beliefs that are the problem. But bias towards individuals in particular bias towards informants doesn't entail biased beliefs, because if I'm biased towards an informant, then I'm going to believe them even if they give me bad news, right? Even if they're telling me what I don't want to hear. So it's not biased beliefs that are coming out of the biased informant. The biased beliefs are something different. It's about believing something for the benefit that it brings. And I don't see that that's any more accessible to us or part of our discourse about ourselves than it ever has been or ever could have been. See, I want to make the constraint, the paradox stuff deep.
That no one would hold a belief that they know to be biased. If they knew it was biased, they wouldn't believe it on that basis, like Pascal's wager. Yeah. Yeah, I guess. Although you might think it's because of the evidence rather than the bias, and it's your bias that leads you to seek certain evidence.
Fine, that's bringing bias in another, in other ways.
But there's another question from Jason.
Sorry, there is, and I just want to jump on some of that from another angle, although I don't know if I'm actually disagreeing. But it made me think that because we're not focusing on the epistemic content of the beliefs, I can recognize what you're describing in sort of the way that book reviews have become partisan. I mean, like the Amazon level stuff, where you can't read a book review without someone criticizing whether this is too left or too right. You know, every idiot wants to tell you how this differs from their own position, kind of thing. And frequently that's true of fiction. Like it's not about the reporting of facts. It's an ideological suspicion, or a suspicion of, as Chris was saying, positionality. There's an insistence that you can't have legitimate representations of points worth taking seriously unless they come from or encompass a certain set of positions or are critical of them. And that's a kind of, I mean, it relates downstream to an epistemic concern, but it's not about recounting facts or getting facts straight. It's about the broader bundles of experiences of the world. So what I want to note is, unlike what you're talking about with Anderson's account, this can describe antagonisms about trust and mistrust that don't relate to simple disputes about facts. There's a tendency to start mistrusting people's whole accounts of themselves or points of view in the world. So I suppose what I'm saying, I don't know whether I'm agreeing or disagreeing with Chris's point, but when he said we worry about losing something of the epistemic character, it's that the account you've got explains this phenomenon of how there's mistrust about others' positions that distances us from even beginning to take their positions seriously before we get to the actual epistemic content of what they're saying. So I suppose I'm just saying it's interesting that this thing you're pointing to covers that broader scenario as well without relating to content. And I think you started out making that a strong claim, an advantage of your view.
Yeah, I think that's right. As long as you're focused on informants, as long as we're focused clear, I wanted to focus. The idea of post-trust is about focusing on informants and informants and having. Sorry, there being a systemic distrust which has sort of political consequences or is politically significant. So yeah, I think as long as you're sticking to that, you got to have informants to keep truth in, right? And the idea here is that once you throw doubt on climate scientists, there's nothing left. Right, there's nothing left to work with, right? Because our own experiences are consistent with, any number of hypotheses that aren't about anthropogenic. So the whole story about viruses and vaccines, the whole story about climate, it's all about trust of knowledge workers. And once we close that door, whatever crazy shit can come in. But I don't think we should be talking about the crazy shit that comes in. I think we should talking about the closing of the door. We should be focusing on the closing of the door, and so that keeps us from trying redescribing people, trying to account for their beliefs in ways they object to.
So the sense in which what you're going for as a strength here is we don't need to commit to a forensic analysis of every batshit idea. It's that we want to be able to be agnostic about that while pointing to the distrust as the pathology.
Yeah, I don't think it's philosophers' jobs to be working out crazy beliefs, and now that, yeah, I don't think that should be. I mean, maybe that's a psychology thing more than really we should be doing. Should we be talking about irrationality and making it? Yeah, I don't know that we should be. Thanks for that.
Thanks. We still have a little bit more time if anyone else wants to say something or has a comment or question.
Yeah, might I come in, Ward? Was just, to get some more clarity on what you're doing. Do you see, or how would you see the connection, if there is any, between epistemic injustice and your notion of mistrust? So it seems that what you're doing might have a kind of normal dimension.
Well, yeah, the second one, the second example of the systemic distrust of complainants of sexual assault is a case of epistemic injustice. It's how I want to approach epistemic injustice, which is not through prejudice, credibility stuff, but through practices. What we've got is a practice of distrusting women. That should be our focus. So that I wouldn't. I'm all for it, but I wanted to get there through social practices.
Thanks. There might be interesting. Yeah. I just think there might be interesting connections to what, from the continental tradition, somebody like Ricoeur or the hermeneutics of suspicion, I think there are interesting connections to make there, but I wouldn't go into that now.
That's awesome. Yeah, email me, please. Please send me some stuff. I'd like to hear about that. No, I don't know what you're talking about there.
Sure.
Thanks.
Thanks. We're almost finished. Do you mind if I press you on one thing, very brief, Ward, just before we end? I was wondering, why do you constrain the conception of post-truth to the suppression of truth, and not consider the manipulation of available information? So, for instance, with algorithms and flooding the airwaves with a certain ideas. So the proliferation of information as opposed to the suppression of information.
Yeah, I mean that I am happy that is happening, and with that way of describing it. But I think even in that context, yeah, here's the basic thought. In a context in which truth is available to you, and let's say truth is available from a customary informant, and you still don't believe it, then if I want to describe what's going on there, I'm committed to attributing something like a bias to you.
Trust.
As long as the truth is there and it's got the backing that everybody else sees, but you're being led away from it, then there's something biasing you. So So that just brings us back to the bias. It doesn't necessarily get you to biased beliefs, but bias is part of the story. And for most people who want to fill out a story of post-truth, I take it involves the attribution of bias of some form.
Mm. Yeah, well, there seems to be increasingly distrust of in our political spaces these days. It seems, I don't know if you've heard about Russell Brand just getting brought up for his sexual indiscretions, and he interestingly went right off the mainstream media and went into a bubble of distrust, which seems very convenient for his own situation. But yeah, I think we've reached our time, and it's been a fruitful, interesting conversation, and I think it really speaks to problems that we're experiencing today. I find that concept of post-trust very helpful. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was really helpful for me to work it through it like this, and then have you guys give questions. Thank you, I appreciate it. Drop me an email if anybody has further comments, please. And again, I'm happy to send papers. Jason wants a paper, I think. Copy of the paper. Thank you.
Yeah. So thanks everyone for coming along today.
Lord. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.
Bye,
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers,
Good to have
guys.
you all here. Thanks.
Cheers.